So the next discussion is moving towards the public infrastructure. Given the gestation for deep tech developments, many of them need to be developed as public goods. Now, what is it that is available as public infrastructure for nurturing deep tech in India? To discuss this, I welcome Sujith Nair, co-founder of the Foundation for Interoperability in Digital Economy for creation of decentralized digital economy ecosystems. Srikanth Chunduri, founder CEO at Framebrick and Agnirva.com, focused on building high impact, large scale, community driven programs. Sujit is the one who co conceptualized the idea of ONDC and onboarded the first set of market participants on ONDC. He also co authored the ONDC strategy paper and was instrumental in setting up of ONDC Limited. Welcome, Sujit. Over to you, Srikanth.
Thank you, Avinash.
Thank you, Avinash. So, hello all again, and welcome to the Fireside chat. Today, we'll be discussing about building public infrastructure for nurturing deep tech as part of the day 3 of Nasscom Future Forge Summit. And Avinash, as you have introduced, Sujith is the CEO and co-founder of FIDE Foundation. So, it's the genesis author of Backend Protocol, which is the basis for ONDC, Open Network for Digital Commerce, Honest, Open Network for Education, Skilling and Training, and the likes. Each of these is a very built-to-scale, decentralized network, and they all have just gotten started. So glad to have you here, Sujith.
My pleasure. Thanks, Srikanth. Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be here.
So Sujith, as I just mentioned, our focus this year is to build deep tech quotient in India, right? And when I say in India, it's in India, but it doesn't have to be restricted to India. It can be built even for the world. So I want to start off by hearing your thoughts. I want to discuss with you on what it takes to build public infrastructure for nurturing deep tech, not just within India, but globally. So it would be great if you could share your initial thoughts about public infrastructure. How do you go about it? How do you develop it? Who develops it? And to help our listeners, most of whom are decision makers, either as startups or enterprises, how should they think about this journey?
No, great question, Srikanth. Firstly, I don't think I'm a deep tech expert. I'm more of a tech generalist than a specialist, as I can see from some of the work I've been doing. No, I think when you asked me to speak about deep tech, I was first wondering, is it just about AI or beyond? I think it's a very interesting way to characterize deep tech, at least for me, from a limited learning and understanding that I have done of not just AI, but beyond AI, like quantum computing, and somebody's talking about nuclear fusion and all that. I think what we're essentially doing with all these nature of technologies is to create this sort of abundance, significant abundance, where, for example, AI is sort of, especially Gen AI, is talking about creating an abundance of creation, quantum abundance of computing, nuclear fusion, somebody's talking about abundance of energy. All of this happening where abundance of a resource, which is because of the significant cost reduction, the marginal cost of generating this is zero or getting close to zero, which is great. I think it's all these technologies over centuries, including electricity, was creating some sort of abundance. And these are all civilization scale shifts that we are seeing, which is fantastic. However, when you look at abundance, it doesn't always mean it's effective, scalable, equitable, inclusive at population scale. How do we make sure that these technologies actually serve humanity in the way that's inclusive and particularly now also serve the planet, given the context of sustainability and climate crisis that we're going through? So that is where I think there could be an opportunity to have this conversation on having an infrastructure thinking, or particularly the digital public infrastructure thinking, or DPI, that India has been very nicely been putting together in the last decade or so. The fact that infrastructure thinking, DPI thinking, I'm sure we must have heard this several times, but just to put this in context, essentially about not thinking about building solutions, because in digital, I think most often we're building solutions. We've been going through that since the beginning of the internet era. We all are building solutions, but how do we, for a moment, step back and have a mindset which doesn't think about building solutions but building infrastructure. And building infrastructure is not something that we don't know. I mean, we've been building roads and bridges and railroads across the country, and we know that it's critical to have infrastructure which is public and open, that allows for whole lot of economic development innovation to happen, as we have seen through centuries. We have done that fairly in an analog world where we built roads, and no one road is private to anybody. You don't build a road just because your house here. You don't build a private road to go to school or a private road to go to college. It's all shared infrastructure that we use, so that somebody can build a bus, a school bus, an auto rickshaw, or somebody can even build a Ferrari. But none of these solutions come with the road. The road has to be created for these solutions to come on top of it. Similarly, I think if you were to apply a bit of that thinking in the digital world, I'm not too sure if we have done enough. After, of course, internet, which is probably the biggest infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, or GPS, or emails, or even our GSM standards for mobile phone, I don't think we have done enough. And India is offering this unique model where we are looking at creating infrastructure beyond what was available, beyond internet. And that's where you see examples like UPI, significant population scale adoption with 10.5 billion people, bringing 500 million people into transaction economy when it comes to payments, people actually doing payments with their phones. I think this is a great example of how do you create technology that does not by itself become a solution. UPI was a protocol. By UPI by itself did nothing, just like how internet by itself, by design of internet, did nothing, but it allowed a whole multitude of solutions to come on top of it in terms of UPI apps, which are several of them, and all of them are market innovations, private innovations using digital public infrastructure, allowing you to do that. That way of thinking is also the thinking behind ONDC. I think you briefly mentioned that, Srikanth, Open Network for Digital Commerce. As to how do we imagine a similar model of inclusive commerce and using protocols like Beacon that I was a part of, I'm still part of. So that thinking, if I were to take that and apply on some of these emerging tech, deep tech, like in the area of AI and all that, and I've been listening to some of the fascinating conversations before us, I think somewhere it'll be important to think about how do we sort of nurture this abundance through an infrastructure thinking, whether it's about how do we think, specifically in the area of AI, how do we create some form of common rails when it comes to maybe around the data side, around the whole the LLM and the modeling side, and the whole thing. I think how do we think about that? I think that would be an important conversation to have, because we don't want a situation where we have abundance but only serving a few people, but we have this sort of abundance serving a lot of people, and that's where I think the way of thinking of infrastructure is very useful.
Interesting. So, just to summarize what you said, I think some of the key takeaways for me have been that when you think infrastructure, you usually think of creating a lot of components. So, it's on the surface, it's to use your analogy, it's like creating patches of tar and road, right? Until you join them together, and then until you put up a policy system of how to use roads, and unless there is training,
Yeah.
that road is going to be pretty useless, and you have to do a lot of planning for the roads. So if I were to, one of the takeaways for me at least is that there is abundance, creating a lot of infrastructure, and then making sure that's equitable and usable by various stakeholders in the ecosystem. So in that sense, abundance is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Just by investing in a lot of independent silos, you're not going to achieve much. You would have just
Interestingly, if I can, sorry to interrupt, Srikanth, I think
yeah.
you're saying even with the DPI thinking, we are also thinking about creating what is essential. I think infrastructure builders don't think about what is sufficient, they think about what is necessary. Yes, we all need an ID. Yes, we all need to find a way to have payments available. But we don't think of the sufficiency of how exactly will a person, say, in remote part of India, will use payments. There is affordance that comes with it. For example,
Yeah.
will the person type if he is not literate? Will the person speak into it? Those are the solutions that will come under the underlying infra, which somebody else will think about. They will solve for some elements of sufficiency. But in general, as an infrastructure, you just look at what is necessary and then allow a whole lot of people to come and build on what should be the sufficient, contextually relevant solutions that caters to everybody's need.
Yeah. So, so you also talked about building, putting this DPI thinking into people, right? So that you're not just creating silos, but an overall system that people can be part of and use. So here's a little bit of a trick question on DPIs, right? We have digital public infrastructure. Assuming we lived in a world with no internet, would what you have said so far in the principles, would they still hold, or are they something to do only with the digital world?
I think they do. I mean, let's take the analog world and let's talk about how energy distribution took off, well over a century. I think somebody thought about creating public utilities. It was not a private utility. The entire, from generation to transmission to distribution to actual consumption, is sort of federated, decentralized, um, um, sort of a multi-stakeholder thing, and it's not one company controlling the entire pipeline in any part of the world. The fact that we all agreed to say let's use alternating current and not direct current, and then on that sort of a thinking or schema or a
Yeah.
standard, everybody said let's visualize how do we electrify the whole world. I mean, that is an example of an infrastructure thinking. So that, I think, it's always been there. I think what I in fact say that internet was extending that. I don't know if it was done consciously or not, but the idea that internet by itself is just about creating that distributed access,
Yeah.
is that infrastructure thinking. Internet did not foresee, let's say, a chat GPT coming, or an Amazon
Yeah.
coming, or an Uber coming, or a Namayatri in Bangalore coming, or an
Yeah. These were
ONDC.
created by end users, so to say, of the internet by
That's right.
themselves, right?
It did not foresee any of that, but it allowed those innovations to happen, and the innovations to sort of diffuse into population scale. And that's, I think, it's an important, I think, useful analogy to look at whenever we think about any new technology that we are going to be embracing.
Yeah. No, interesting. That's a very encouraging takeaway, because while we are talking about deep tech and public infrastructure, most often the discussion just goes into tech and ML. So my final takeaway from this is that thinking of public infrastructure creation could be applied even beyond deep tech, but it is something, and it's a thinking that has existed probably in different silos. Internet, as you say, just amplifies that whole thing, right? So that brings me to a kind of an operational question, right? So
Yeah.
obviously this is a very large journey, right? Infrastructure, and as you mentioned, initially, that each stakeholder, each user of the internet or in the business world does what they do best, right? There are entrepreneurs creating products and services. There are governments. There are businesses.
Yeah.
To take your road analogy, right? A car maker may or may not worry necessarily about the road. They have to stay focused on making the car, right? A tar creator, or has to worry about that. And there are thousands of such people who participate in a road building exercise and in the utility of the road. Now, so obviously this very clearly seems like a multi-stakeholder journey, right? If we talk about public infrastructure in deep tech, but who would you qualify as the critical stakeholders who are responsible for building and the critical beneficiaries? Or is it that every beneficiary is a stakeholder? How do we define? It's way too complex. So is there a thinking you have to help us understand? How do you prioritize these?
Yeah, I think so. When you come to infrastructure, I think the stakeholders, on the stakeholder side, firstly, I think it's important to think about um people. Okay, keep people in the center, and as ultimately, all these technologies has to sort of precipitate into improving people's lives, all kinds of lives, and now we're talking about improving a situation of the planet. So it's just people and planet would probably be the center of this discussion in terms of who the
Yeah.
beneficiaries are, but these technologies actually create value, not just for people but also for people who are offering solutions to these people, right? So corporations, governments, everybody, I think they're all sort of beneficiaries to this. In terms of stakeholders who come to make this happen, of course, I think more than me, I think others have said it better. I think it requires effort from academia, from research and development, market, the civil society, volunteers. Many of the efforts that you've seen in India around digital public infrastructure has come through largely with a lot of volunteering talent and not-for-profit efforts. So it requires a collective effort of all this. But I think what is critical is to find a way to bring all them together. Because normally when you have a multi-stakeholder thing, sometimes it's very difficult to bring all of them onto a very one seamless sort of a fabric to collaborate, co-create. It does splinter away into silos. So how do we do all that? So I think it's important, therefore, to have a very clear sort of a way to bring them together. I mean, generally, I've seen somebody putting together a vision, articulating into some sort of a framework that brings all these people together and start participating. And that could be somewhat top down. And I think government is in a great place to do that. UPA started as a consultation paper working with not for profit to make sure that there's some thinking going behind that. But it could also be bottom up. It can also be bottom up, where probably some of the efforts that are happening in silos sort of come together before they hit sort of critical mass to agree on, hey, is there a need to create a shared infrastructure? So, I mean, if everybody does that one thing well, somebody may be building the LLM models well, somebody may be actually thinking about bringing the rich data set, somebody may be talking about reimagining compute that some of these things require, all of them, but agreeing that is there a common set of standards, specifications, interoperability, and a framework to work together so that each one is amplifying others' effort and not spiraling down. I think I think the trick is in getting multi-stakeholder, not just identifying them, but also make them work together. And some shared framework would be useful in that context.
Yeah, and I think what's encouraging is that you said that this is not necessarily a top-down starting from the government, but it's equally likely it can be bottom-up. So for the people who are listening, who are potential volunteers, enterprises, I think they could also participate. They don't have to wait for someone else to take an initiative.
That's right.
Great. I think we are out of time, but this has been deeply insightful. Thank you so much, Sujith, for sharing your idea and principles on how to build this public infrastructure for.
Well, thank you so much. Really
Thanks,
enjoyed this.
Sujith. Thanks, Srikanth.
Thank you.
It's good to hear about the necessity and sufficiency of digital infrastructure. It's very critical, and what is being done to adopt digital infrastructure